The prairie stretches endlessly, wind rippling over tall grass and sun-bleached bone. In the 1870s, Kansas was a place of promise, a frontier spilling with homesteaders, drifters, and dreamers drawn west by the promise of land, freedom, and anonymity. But beneath the myth of the rugged pioneer was something darker, something festering. Just outside the small, dusty settlement of Cherry Vale in Labette County, a modest one-room home stood near the Osage Trail, a place weary travelers might welcome as a brief reprieve. It had a garden, a rough-hewn barn, and a small general store out front. The family who lived there, the Benders, were German immigrants, quiet and hard-working. John Bender Sr. spoke broken English. His wife, Kate Sr., spoke none. Their children, John Jr. and Kate Jr., were more social. John Jr. laughed oddly at inappropriate times, and Kate Jr. spoke at length about her psychic powers and ability to communicate with the dead. She held seances and advertised spiritual healing. No one could quite agree if she was gifted or insane, but in that lawless corner of Kansas, nobody asked too many questions. This strange family had land, paid their dues, and kept mostly to themselves. That was enough, for a time. Yet beneath their floorboards, in the dark belly of that small prairie home, something unspeakable festered. It would take 2 years before travelers began whispering of disappearances, of friends who never made it to their destinations. One man never returned, then another. Then an entire wagon train vanished without trace. Still, there were no arrests, no organized investigation. The vast frontier had many ways of swallowing men whole: illness, bandits, Comanche raids, nature. But in Labette County, it wasn't the wild that hunted men. It was the Bender family. They called them the Bloody Benders, only after the truth crawled out of the orchard soil. They were called many other things too. America's first serial killer family, the pioneers of deception, the Kansas Butchers. Their inn was not a home, but a slaughterhouse in disguise. The travelers who entered never left. Their bodies were found later, buried in shallow graves behind the barn, faces crushed, throats slit, personal belongings stolen. The Benders did not kill in passion, they killed in routine. And when the town finally caught on, the family vanished, leaving behind only blood, bones, and questions. To understand how the Benders got away with it for so long, you have to understand the land. Post-Civil War, Kansas was a brutal place, a patchwork of sod homes, scattered settlements, and long dusty trails with little law and less oversight. Homesteaders arrived by the thousands, staking claims under the 1862 Homestead Act. The Osage Trail, which cut directly past the Bender property, was a primary artery for migrants heading west. It was busy, transient, and tragically perfect for murder. If someone disappeared out here, there were no neighbors to hear screams, no lawmen nearby to investigate, just grass, dirt, and silence. The Benders picked their location carefully. They settled in 1870, building their home near the trail, splitting it into 2 rooms with a thick canvas curtain. The front room served as a general store and modest inn. The back, that was where the family lived, ate, and planned, and killed. Kate Bender, the daughter, became the face of the operation. Young, articulate, and charismatic, she quickly gained a reputation not just as a hostess, but as a spiritualist. Her handbills offered healing, readings, and connections to the dead. Some said she could summon spirits, others whispered that her seances were a cover for something darker. Men traveling alone were the usual clientele. She invited them in, smiled warmly, and served them dinner. Her father or brother would slip behind the canvas curtain, and then, with practiced precision, they would strike. A hammer to the skull, a slit throat to ensure silence, and down the body would go through the trapdoor into the cellar. It was all done in seconds. They buried the victims in the orchard, planted neatly in rows like rotten crops. Stranger still, many who disappeared had wealth on them: cash, horses, supplies. Some were traveling to start businesses. Others were veterans of the war with pension MO. Nay. And yet, no one connected the dots for years. Some settlers even spoke kindly of the Benders, especially Kate. They remembered her eyes, sharp and unreadable, the way she spoke with unnatural calm. A few said her presence made the hair on their arms rise. Others swore they heard things in the orchard at night, whispers, sobs, the gurgle of a final breath. But no one asked questions, because no one wanted to know the truth, not in Labette County, not yet. In early 1873, the mystery finally began to unravel, not from a breakthrough in law enforcement, but from the grief of a persistent brother. Dr. William York was a well-known physician and Civil War veteran. When he set off along the Osage Trail to investigate the fate of a missing family friend, he promised to return in a few days. He never did. His brothers, one a colonel and the other a state senator, grew alarmed. This wasn't a man who simply vanished. He was respected, meticulous, and loved. And unlike most families who mourned quietly or accepted the silence, the York brothers used their influence. A search party was formed, and questions were asked, loud ones, with political weight. The Benders by then were nervous. Kate and John Jr. grew more erratic in public. Neighbors later recalled the family becoming cold, cagey. Then, just days before authorities planned to search their property, the Benders vanished entirely. The house was abandoned, the livestock wandered the yard unfed, plates still sat on the table, a heavy stench crept from beneath the floorboards. What they left behind was not just a scene, it was an open grave. Lawmen and townspeople pried open the trapdoor and descended into a nightmare. The cellar floor was thick with congealed blood, some of it black with age. Bone fragments littered the dirt. In the orchard behind the house, they began to dig, and one by one the secrets surfaced. 11 confirmed corpses were uncovered. Most had crushed skulls. Many had slashed throats. Some were decomposed beyond recognition. Among them, Dr. William York, his features barely distinguishable but his fate now known. Locals were stunned. They'd dined with these people, shopped in their store, let their children walk past the house. Some felt shame for not noticing. Others insisted they'd always sensed something was off. Kate's glassy stare, the nervous tics of John Jr., the way the air around the property always felt heavier than it should. A few vigilantes swore they'd find the Benders themselves. Rumors spread that they were caught and hanged in the woods. Others believed they boarded a train and started over, perhaps in another state, under different names, selling the same spiritual lies. But the truth was worse than disappearance. It was that no one ever truly saw them to begin with, just the illusion they projected, until the blood soaked through the floor. The discovery of the bodies didn't just horrify, it unmoored something in the American psyche. The frontier had always carried danger, outlaws, native resistance, starvation, isolation. But this was something else. This was evil disguised as domestic life. A family unit, the very symbol of civilization, had turned the hearth into a butcher's den. Mothers locked their doors tighter. Travelers carried more than just rifles, they carried suspicion. And in Kansas, the name Bender became shorthand for betrayal. Local newspapers couldn't get enough. The Demon Family, Kansas Fiends, The Devil's Inn, headlines screamed across the Midwest. But beyond the sensationalism was a chilling truth. The Benders had been hiding in plain sight for years. What disturbed people most wasn't just the number of bodies or the gruesome method. It was the methodical nature of it all. The canvas curtain, the positioning of the chair, the trapdoor beneath the rug, the orchard as a graveyard. These weren't crimes of rage or panic. They were premeditated rituals, repeated again, and always, Kate's face at the center of it, calm, smiling, unreadable. She had convinced strangers she could speak to their dead. In the end, she sent them to join them. Authorities circulated descriptions, but the Benders were ghosts. Theories spiraled. One woman matching Kate's description was arrested in Michigan in 1889, but authorities couldn't confirm her identity. Another man, thought to be John Jr., was lynched in Montana. Nothing was proven. The Benders had evaporated into the very landscape they had once defiled. Some believed they died shortly after fleeing. Others insisted they returned to Germany. A more disturbing theory, they simply changed names, settled somewhere new, and kept killing. Perhaps they weren't the only ones. Perhaps they were just the ones who got caught. The site of the Bender home, became a kind of cursed landmark. People chipped away pieces of wood from the house as souvenirs. Others came to gawk at the orchard, wondering which tree had shaded which corpse. Eventually, the house was torn down. Nothing remains today except a marker and the memory. But locals say if you walk the field at dusk, you can feel it. Something sour in the wind, something watching. The silence there doesn't feel empty. It feels listening. And in the long shadow of that prairie sky, the legend of the bloody benders still hums through the grass, because some stories don't die, they just wait to be unearthed again. In the wake of the gruesome discovery, the people of Labette County were left with more than grief. They were left with the guilt of ignorance. For over 2 years, the Benders lived among them, shopped in the same stores, attended church, laughed at community fairs, and in that same time, men, women, and even children vanished. Yet not once had anyone suspected the quiet German family living off the trail. The public reckoning came not only in the form of investigation, but in denial. Many insisted they had known something was wrong, that they'd always felt uneasy. Others claimed they'd avoided the Benders entirely. A few who had once sung Kate's praises now called her a witch. The town itself tried to erase the shame, but the stain had soaked deep into the soil. During the excavation, investigators found more than just bodies. They found personal effects, rings, pocket watches, Bibles, children's dolls, all stacked and stored in a crude crawlspace beneath the house. It was as if the Benders had built their lives atop the lives they ended, standing on bones with false smiles. Some of the remains were so decomposed they could not be identified. Whole families had likely perished there, swallowed in a single night by kindness offered from across a table. The Benders were equal opportunity killers, young, old, rich, poor. There was no consistent profile. The only common thread was vulnerability. And then there was the cellar. Even days after the family had fled, the room reeked of iron and decay. The walls were damp and streaked with what locals swore was blood. No one wanted to descend the narrow steps, yet everyone did. Reporters, townsfolk, even children. It became a pilgrimage of horror. They whispered that Kate had performed rituals down there, that her spiritualism wasn't fake, it was dark. There were rumors of symbols drawn beneath the floorboards, of candles found bersas. Ned into the dirt. Was it a family of killers or a family of cultists? But no charges could be filed. There were no suspects to stand trial, and so justice unraveled into folklore. Wanted posters with the Benders' names yellowed and tore in the wind. Deputies followed leads that dissolved at every border. The official line was that the Benders escaped, but the unofficial whisper was more disturbing. Maybe evil like that doesn't get caught. Maybe it just moves. It wasn't long before the country lost interest, but Labette County never forgot. For years afterward, travelers would stop and ask locals about the old Bender place. The answers varied. Some told the story with theatrical flair, painting the Benders as demonic, inhuman creatures. Others grew silent, refusing to speak of it at all. The trauma had become generational, passed down like a scar. Children grew up playing near the orchard where bones once lay. They dared each other to touch the soil. They whispered that if you said Kate Bender's name 3 times near the old well, you could hear the trapdoor creak open beneath your feet. Folklore fed the legend, but facts kept it alive. Multiple families were confirmed to have disappeared while passing the Bender property. The trail logs showed names of those last seen alive near the inn. A few were entire groups, travelers with no ties, no next of kin to raise alarm. And that was the secret to the Benders' success. They preyed on the forgotten, men seeking fortune, widows heading west, immigrants with few belongings and no one to miss them. They vanished quietly, swallowed not by the wilderness, but by the false hospitality of a kitchen table. Even the government's investigation faltered under the weight of uncertainty. Rewards were posted, posses formed, dozens of false arrests made. In 1884, a woman claiming to be Kate Bender was arrested in Michigan. Locals flooded the courthouse, demanding justice, but without clear evidence or photographs. The trial devolved into confusion and hysteria. The woman was eventually released, and the trail went cold once more. Still, Every few years, someone claimed to have seen them, an old man with a limp in Idaho, a woman who never aged in Colorado. Like ghosts, the Benders persisted in rumor and shadow, but those who knew the truth, the men who dug the graves, the families who identify, the remains, the neighbors who once waved at the Bender children, carried something heavier than fear. They carried betrayal, the realization that evil didn't come with red eyes or sharp teeth. It came with a smile, a hot meal, and a room for the night, and that realization never truly left Kansas. Because out on that lonely trail, where grass now grows undisturbed, the wind still carries the names of the missing, and the silence, it feels earned. Even now, over a century later, the Benders still haunt the American imagination, not as ghosts, but as a dark mirror to the myth of the frontier. For all the romanticism layered onto the Wild West, the Benders were a reminder that the untamed land didn't just attract the bold, it attracted the monstrous. In the vast openness of Kansas, no one could hear a scream if the wind was strong. No one kept records tight enough to notice when the same family bought one too many sets of boots, or hoarded watches that never told the same time. It was the perfect hunting ground, and the Benders used it well. As more victims were identified, patterns emerged, not just in how they were killed, but in how they were chosen. One man had recently sold his farm, another carried his entire savings westward. A young woman was said to be running from scandal, her shame making her an easy mark. The Benders targeted the hopeful, the desperate, and the alone. People with dreams, not anchors. People whose deaths wouldn't cause a riot, only a sigh. In that sense, their crimes weren't just murders, they were a commentary on a nation expanding faster than it could protect its people. Among the artifacts found in the Benders' home was a Bible belonging to a child. Her name was never released. Her body, they say, was never found. But the small, hand-stitched name tag sewn into the leather told investigators that she'd come from Pennsylvania, that she'd traveled over 1,000 miles, that someone, somewhere, had loved her once. The brutality of what was done to her, what was done to so many, was impossible to ignore. But it was just as impossible to fully explain. Why a whole family would kill together, why they stayed together through it, why no one ever turned on the others. Some psychologists later speculated about shared psychosis, folia famille. Others blamed cult-like dynamics, perhaps apatria, arch enforcing madness with force. But those were theories crafted decades after the fact, from the safety of university halls. The people of Labette County had no such comfort. They lived through the silence, they dug up the bodies, they cleaned the cellar, and every time a new stranger passed through, they wondered, just for a second, who would miss this one if they disappeared tonight. In the years that followed the Benders' disappearance, their story mutated, not just into legend, but into an almost sacred warning. Lawmen in neighboring states began training new deputies with a simple lesson: always investigate the quiet ones. Never ignore a missing traveler, and never, ever underestimate the evil that can hide behind polite smiles. Yet, as time passed and the details faded, that lesson eroded like the grave mounds behind the orchard. Curiosity turned the site into a morbid attraction. People traveled from miles away to visit the empty patch of prairie, picking wildflowers from the soil where corpses once lay. Some took chunks of foundation stone, convinced they were cursed relics. Others claimed they heard voices at night, soft, gurgling, indecipherable. But what truly kept the Bender legend alive wasn't the ghost stories, it was the complete lack of closure. The fact that not one of them was ever caught, that no one stood trial, that justice never came. It was as if they had evaporated into the very myths that Kansas was built on. And that uncertainty, that unbearable open-endedness, became the most terrifying part of the tale. Because if the Benders could escape, could disappear so thoroughly, who else might have done the same? What other families had learned from them, copied them, hidden in plain sight with just enough charm to stay invisible? One local newspaper editor, writing in 1891, said it best: "It is not the murders that chill us, it is the ease with which they were done. A woman smiled and men died, a family offered supper, and the bones of a stranger were fed to the garden. What frightens us is not the violence, but the hospitality." The Benders had inverted every symbol of comfort and trust. The kitchen table, the family, the prairie home, all turned into instruments of horror. The cellar was eventually filled in, though townsfolk claimed the ground would never hold grass there again. The well was capped, the orchard cut down, but nature forgets nothing, and on certain summer nights, the wind blowing across that empty lot carries more than dust. It carries memory, it carries a name. Kate Bender, a name that once meant warmth and healing and sanctuary, and now means something else entirely, something that still hasn't finished its story. As the case slipped from headlines into folklore, one detail kept resurfacing in whispered accounts: Kate Bender's eyes. Survivors, townsfolk, even children who had only glimpsed her in town described them as unnerving, not cruel, not angry, empty, a kind of vacant confidence that made people feel she already knew their end. She'd sit quietly behind the store counter, brushing her long dark hair, speaking in a slow, almost melodic tone. She didn't flirt, she didn't threaten, she simply made you feel watched. Men who encountered her said she had a way of pulling information out of you without asking. Others claimed she'd known things she shouldn't: birthdays, illnesses, fears. Whether she was a true spiritualist or a con artist remains uncertain, but there's no denying the power she had. It was Kate who placed the men in the chair near the curtain, Kate who charmed them into staying the night, and likely Kate who gave the signal. Her seances, advertised with eerie confidence, were little more than lures. She wrote pamphlets about spiritual enlightenment and offered healing touches to those grieving dead loved ones. But behind the curtain, someone waited with a hammer, and beneath the floorboards, the soil was already disturbed. For some, the most disturbing theory wasn't that Kate was part of it, but that she led it, that John Sr. and the others followed her, that she, the youngest, the most poised, was the mind behind the madness. Her writings were later recovered, flowery prose about destiny, rebirth, punishment, and divine justice. Mixed among the spiritual jargon were chilling phrases that seemed to betray more than metaphor. Blood is the path to revelation, one read. Another, they return through the soil, baptized in the silence of the orchard. Modern historians have speculated about early signs of cult behavior. Was it a family under religious delusion, or was it all cold-blooded opportunism dressed in spiritual language? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the Benders began with fraud and ended in fanaticism. Whatever the case, Kate remained the focal point, long after her face disappeared. And if she did survive, if she changed her name and settled somewhere else, then the eyes that haunted Labette County may have stared down others, in another town, with another smile, and another trapdoor waiting in the dark. The search for the Benders didn't end when their house was emptied. In fact, it had only begun. Kansas Governor Thomas A. Osborne offered a $3,000 reward, a fortune at the time, for the capture of any or all of the Bender family. Pinkerton detectives were dispatched. Lawmen followed every rumor, scouring train stations, logging stagecoach manifests, and even interrogating immigrants heading east instead of west. But the Benders had vanished with a precision that unnerved even seasoned investigators. They'd left no trace, no discarded belongings, no stolen horses found, not even a single verifiable sighting. That's when the whispers of frontier justice began. Some said a group of local men had tracked them down in the woods days after their escape, tied them to trees, and beat them until their screams turned into gurgles. The bodies were supposedly dumped into a ravine and never found. Others claimed Kate had turned on the rest of her family, killed them herself, and disappeared into the wilderness. Still others swore they saw her working as a nurse in Minnesota or a housekeeper in New York under the name Sarah Elroy. Every woman with dark hair and sharp eyes became a suspect. Every odd family in a new town was eyed with suspicion. The Benders had become less a family and more a spectre, a name that crawled under people's skin. The investigation stretched into the 20th century. In 1889, 2 women arrested for unrelated crimes in Michigan were identified by locals as Kate and her mother. The court proceedings drew national attention, but the case collapsed under a lack of evidence, and the women were released. By then, most of the original investigators were dead. The records had faded, and the faces had aged. There would be no justice, only story. Yet one investigator made a chilling note in the margin of his journal. They are still out there, or others like them. We search in vain for four faces, but we should be looking at the face of America itself. We breed monsters in open land. His words would never be printed, but they echoed a growing fear that maybe it wasn't just the Benders. Maybe the isolation, the lawlessness, and the hunger of the frontier could turn anyone into a killer. And maybe, just maybe, this family wasn't an anomaly at all, but the blueprint for a kind of evil we still don't want to admit lives among us. There was something ritualistic in the Benders' methods, something that suggested not only practicality but a performance. The room was always arranged the same way, the guests seated at the head of the table, back to the canvas curtain. Behind that veil, one of the Benders waited with a hammer. The cellar door beneath the chair creaked open silently. The kill was quick, almost theatrical, a blow to the skull, a slice to the throat. Then the curtain drawn back, the chair tilted, and the body slipped through the floor like a magic trick. Except there was no applause, only silence. No audience, but the dead. Why repeat the same method over and over unless it carried meaning? That question obsessed investigators long after the Benders vanished. Some believed the family had developed a ritual out of necessity, perfecting their timing, reducing mistakes. But others wondered if it was more than that, if the act of killing had become sacred to them, a kind of rite, the way the table was always set, the way Kate's spiritual sessions preceded certain disappearances, the way the victims were buried in neat rows, their belongings stored as if they were offerings. It didn't feel random, it felt deliberate. One account from a neighbor spoke of a stormy night when he passed by the Bender house and saw a dim orange glow in the orchard. He thought it was lightning at first, until he saw shadows moving in a circle and the flicker of candles low to the ground. He never reported it at the time, but after the bodies were found, he couldn't shake the image. Were they burying victims under cover of night, or doing something else entirely? Theories ranged from spiritual delusion to satanic worship. Some called them possessed. Others claimed they were simply opportunists without conscience. But every attempt to categorize them fell short. There was always something inhuman about the way I worked together. A family dynamic that didn't fit any known psychology. No jealousy, no betrayal, no guilt, just unity in murder. It's that cold, synchronized cruelty that continues to haunt historians. Because we understand rage, we understand desperation, but we do not understand a family that sits down to dinner after spilling blood and calmly plans who to kill next. After the Bender homestead was emptied and the orchard became a cemetery, officials allowed the public to tour the property for a brief window of time. What followed was a parade of morbid fascination. Families from neighboring towns arrived by wagon, bringing their children to walk the rows of graves. Men poked at the cellar walls with sticks. Women cried over rusted hairpins and broken spectacles left behind. Reporters scribbled notes while standing on blood-stained floorboards. One journalist described it as a carnival of death. Another wrote that the air hangs heavy with judgment and the birds do not sing. The Bender house quickly took on the aura of a relic. Locals began to chisel pieces from the foundation, hoping to carry home a piece of the nightmare. Some claimed to hear footsteps when no one was near. Others found handprints on their wagons the next morning. One farmer who lived a mile from the site refused to go near the land, insisting he saw lights flickering in the orchard long after the house was abandoned. Over time, as interest waned and the building decayed, the house was dismantled. Wood from the structure was repurposed for barns, sheds, and furniture across the county. People later claimed those pieces were cursed, bringing sudden illness, violent dreams, and deaths with no explanation. But what lingered longer than superstition was the memory of who was found in that soil. Dr. William York, Henry Mackenzie, George Newton Longcore, and his 18-month-old daughter, Mary Ann. The details of their deaths were brutal, but it was Mary Ann's grave that silenced even the most hardened investigators. Her tiny body was discovered buried beneath her father's. There were no signs of trauma, only that she had been suffocated, likely after witnessing his murder. Her doll was found nearby, wrapped in a torn scrap of linen. The coroner, unable to complete his tez, simply wrote, "The child did not deserve this." Mary Ann's grave became a symbol of innocence stolen, of the price of looking the other way, and of the brutal truth that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear aprons, sell canned goods, and offer a place to sleep. And by the time you realize what's behind the curtain, the trapdoor's already open. The town of Cherryvale tried to move on. The homestead was razed, the orchard ploughed under, the Bender's name was scrubbed from official records, but the unease lingered like an infection under the skin. For decades, locals refused to walk the trail after sundown. Stories passed from parent to child, each darker than the last. That the orchard still wept blood during the spring rains. That the cellar door sometimes reappeared, half buried in mud. That if you stood too long on the lot, you'd feel the ground shift, like something was moving beneath. Teachers stopped mentioning the Benders in school. Churches warned against discussing them from the pulpit, and yet children still snuck out at night, daring each other to touch the old well or lie down in the field where the bodies had been exhumed. One girl, in 1924, claimed she saw Kate Bender walking the perimeter of the orchard in the fog, her hair soaked, her mouth open but silent. Her parents dismissed it as imagination. A week later, the child stopped speaking entirely. But the silence wasn't just in the town. It infected the archives. Pages were lost, testimonies redacted, photographs of the home disappeared. The official inquest into the Bender killings was, bizarrely, never published in full. Historians later noted entire sections missing from state archives, particularly those related to Kate's writings and the cellar layout. It was as if someone wanted not only to erase the memory, but the possibility of studying it. And so the Benders became a kind of forbidden legend, too real to be myth, too monstrous to be explained. The land itself seemed to reject closure. Crops planted on the site failed year after year. A barn built there burned down without cause. Animals avoided the pasture. One land surveyor who visited the area in the 1930s left behind a single line in his field notes, written in the margin beside. A map. Avoid this parcel. Something wrong with the soil. No birds, no wind. In the end, what terrified people most wasn't that the Benders had existed, it was that they might not be gone, that somewhere a family still gathers around a table, sets the plates, lights the lantern, and waits for a knock at the door. As the decades rolled on, the bloody Benders slipped deeper into American folklore, but unlike most legends, their story wasn't softened with time, it sharpened. In a country obsessed with serial killers and macabre family sagas, the Benders remained uniquely terrifying. There was no Ed Gein-like lone recluse, no Charles Manson-style cult leader. There were four people, a nuclear family, working in unison, murdering without apparent remorse or conflict. That was what made them unforgettable. Not just the brutality of their crimes, but the collaboration. The family dynamic confused even modern criminologists. Case studies often focus on dominant patriarchs or manipulative matriarchs, but here, the power structure was elusive. John Sr. was mute and reclusive. His wife, coarse and violent, barely spoke English. John Jr., with his high-pitched, nervous laughter, was considered slow or unstable by many. But Kate was poised, confident, articulate. She wrote manifestos, she led seances, she addressed crowds, and she drew men in. She was, as one paper put it, the flame that attracted the moth and the knife that cut off its wings. When profiling the Benders decades later, the FBI Behavioral Science Unit categorized their crimes as organized, opportunistic, and emotionally cold. Yet that classification barely scratched the surface. The ritualism, the buried personal effects, the preserved body positions, the fact that some of the victims still had untouched valuables on them, hinted at a motive beyond greed. If it had just been about money, they would have fled after the first killing, or the fifth, or the 10th. But they didn't. They stayed, perfected the pattern, smiled through it, and still, no one turned them in. Neighbors visited, travelers rested, locals bought supplies, all beneath the same roof that housed bloodstains beneath the floor. Why didn't anyone act? Why? Didn't anyone ask questions? Perhaps the Benders didn't just know how to kill. Perhaps they knew how to charm a community into silence. That's what makes their story so unsettling. It's not that a family turned into monsters, it's that they were monsters from the start, and no one saw them for what they were, or worse. Maybe some did, and simply chose to look away. By now, you might be wondering how so many people could disappear without causing immediate alarm. The truth lies in the nature of the time. The 1870s were not a world of surveillance or interconnected records. The West was a fluid, transient place, full of people moving toward promises of land or opportunity, and many of them never arrived at their destinations. Letters went unanswered. Horses returned riderless. Families assumed the worst. Indian attacks, illness, runaway debts, but they didn't assume murder, and they certainly didn't assume a family of murderers waiting at the edge of the trail. The Benders understood this. They positioned their home on a remote stretch of the Osage Trail, a key route for migrants and traders, where isolation was a shield. It gave them what every predator needs: control of the terrain. They watched travelers from a distance before inviting them in. They knew which wagons carried money, which guests traveled alone. And once the sun set and the lantern was lit, the outcome was almost always the same. A warm meal, a chair placed precisely over the trapdoor, a polite smile from Kate, and then nothing. In the end, the Benders weren't caught because there was no one left to report them. Their victims were often people whose absences were expected, whose deaths were plausible. A man heading to Colorado might vanish without question. A widow heading west might never be heard from again. And if no one raised a voice, then the Benders kept their hands clean, at least in the eyes of the law. The discovery of their crimes forced a kind of national self-reflection, not just on the brutality of frontier life, but on the myth of the wholesome settler family. If the Benders could kill dozens without suspicion, what other evils might be hiding behind homestead doors? Newspapers stoked the fear. Sermons warned congregants to beware of false hospitality. Mothers forbade their children from speaking to strangers, but deep down, the terror remained the same. Evil had worn an apron and said grace before dinner, and the Benders had shown the world that you don't need a mask or a monster's face to be deadly. You just need charm, a little patience, and a hole in the floor. As time marched on, the Bender murders became more than a crime. They became a template for American horror. Long before family annihilators entered the lexicon, before the term serial killer was even coined, the Benders were already practicing the craft of calculated slaughter. And they did it not as outsiders, but as neighbors. That's what struck the deepest nerve. They weren't hidden in caves or on the run. They were seated next to you at church, selling flour at the store, smiling at your child as you passed them on the road. It was precisely that normalcy that made their crimes endure. People didn't just fear what the Benders had done, they feared what it said about themselves, about their own instincts, about their blindness, because every town had a Kate Bender, a woman too quiet, too confident, too strange. Every road had a house set too far back from the trail. Every disappearance that had once been shrugged off now returned, crawling from the grave of memory. What if they had been part of the tally and just never knew it? Modern true crime obsessives sometimes revisit the Bender story as a kind of historical curiosity, but it's anything but that. The psychology of the Bender family has never been fully explained. They weren't abusive to one another. There were no records of internal violence, no sibling rebellion, no escape attempts. 4 people, together, sharing not just a roof, but a purpose, a routine, a darkness. That kind of unity in horror is exceedingly rare. One theory, whispered among local historians but rarely published, suggested the Benders were part of something larger, that they weren't the only ones on the trail practicing these methods, that their house was simply the most successful, the most organized, the one that went too far. An outlier, yes, but not an anomaly. A letter, long since lost, reportedly written by a survivor fro. A neighboring county, spoke of a family with similar habits, an inn of last rest, where guests were too often lost to the earth. Whether that claim was truth, delusion, or opportunistic myth, no one can say, but it remains one more terrifying possibility in a case already filled with too many. The idea that the bloody Benders weren't the beginning, only the ones who got caught, in a story that never truly ended. By the mid-20th century, as America industrialized and the myth of the Old West faded into nostalgic fiction, the Bender story remained unshakably real, a stain on the nation's origin myth. In a land of pioneers and promise, the Benders were the rot hiding beneath the floorboards. Small historical societies tried to preserve what little remained of the case: newspaper clippings, hand-drawn maps, weathered reward posters. But much of it had already been lost to fire, misfiling, or what some suspected was intentional burial. The Benders had become not only a cautionary tale, but an inconvenient one, a reminder that American exceptionalism had always been tangled with savagery. What continued to baffle researchers was the silence around the family's origins. They appeared in Labette County as if from fog. John Sr. was said to be from Germany or the Netherlands, Kate Sr. perhaps from Hungary. John Jr. may not have even been their son, some said, but a drifter adopted into their crimes. And Kate? There were whispers that she wasn't a Bender at all, but a con artist from the East posing as a medium. No birth records, no family connections, no past. It was as if they had materialized from the soil, fully formed and already bloodthirsty. In truth, this mystery may have been by design. If they changed names frequently or traveled under false identities, they could have reinvented themselves more than once. What Kansas knew as the Benders may have been only the final version, the last face they wore before they disappeared. That idea kept historians and folklorists alike hunting for their traces. Census records were combed for families with similar structures, early photographs scrutinized, but every lead fell into dust. The Benders remained shadows. Occasionally, artifacts surfaced: a rusted carving knife supposedly pulled from a river, a ring with initials matching a known vase, Tim, a rotted ledger found in an attic with names crossed out in red. Whether these items were genuine or forged didn't matter. People wanted connection, proof that evil leaves fingerprints. But perhaps the most disturbing possibility was this: that some evil doesn't leave a trail at all. It vanishes. With intention, with silence, with the kind of intelligence that doesn't just kill, but plans for the aftermath. Because families vanish every day, roads still cut through nowhere, and somewhere a door opens, a chair waits, and the night grows very, very quiet. It was in the silence that fear took root. After the bodies were buried, after the cellar was filled in and the last visitor picked clean the ruins of the Bender house, the people of Labette County were left with something no shovel could cover: dread. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that whispers while you're alone in your room, thinking about how close you came. Everyone knew someone who had passed that house, who had spoken to Kate, who had stood on that porch and said, "Maybe next time." The local churches leaned into the narrative, declaring the Benders agents of Satan, devils in human form. They warned that to allow such evil into your home, even just through gossip, was to invite darkness into your soul. But beneath the sermons, fear had metastasized into something worse: paranoia. Every stranger was a threat. Every family too quiet was suspect. Even among neighbors, suspicion festered. Accusations flew. Property lines became battle lines. And still, the Benders weren't found. Rumors kept them alive. A couple in Nebraska, found living under false names, was hanged by a mob before they could be questioned. A recluse in Arizona was found with old Kansas newspapers stuffed into his trunk, alongside 4 human teeth. Every few years, a new sighting, a new arrest, but always it slipped through, like they were taunting the world from beyond reach. Meanwhile, the children of Labette County grew up in the long shadow of that orchard. They heard the stories whispered from porches, carved initials into the trees where graves had been dug, and dared each other to spend nights alone in the field. Some swore they heard crying. Others said they saw a curtain billow in a window that no longer existed. By 1900, a historian visiting the site wrote in his journal, "The wind does not behave properly here. It stutters, it stalls, it waits." He wasn't a superstitious man, Beeson. But when he reached the center of the field, he claimed he felt a hand press against his back. No one was behind him. Some places carry weight. This one carried names, unspoken, unwritten, but always felt. A presence that didn't need to shout to be heard, because in Kansas, silence wasn't absence. It was the loudest scream of all. Among those most haunted by the Bender case were not the townsfolk or historians, but the families of the missing. In an age where documentation was sparse and communication delayed by weeks, many never even knew their loved ones had vanished until the graves were unearthed. For some, the news arrived months, sometimes years, too late. A brother who left Illinois in 1872, bound for Texas. A newlywed couple last seen in Missouri, never heard from again. A father who promised to send for his wife and children once he'd found work. Instead, their names joined a list carved into pine at the edge of a prairie, bodies buried, identities lost. Some families made the pilgrimage to the orchard, not for closure, but to stand over disturbed earth and say goodbye to bones they couldn't identify. One woman, Mrs. Lydia Southworth, traveled from Ohio after hearing rumors that her missing son had been found in Kansas. She arrived too late. The body had been buried in a mass grave marked only as male, late 20s, fractured skull, gold tooth. She sat beside the grave for 3 days without speaking, then returned home and was never seen in public again. Her house grew over with ivy. Her curtains were always drawn. And this is the part most people forget. The Bender killings weren't just a series of brutal murders. They were a wave of disappearances that fractured families across the country. Some victims were never confirmed. Others were only recognized by the clothes they wore or a tattoo on a shoulder. And in the absence of answers, what bloomed was a generational ache. Sons who never returned. Fathers who vanished mid-journey. Sisters who were last seen smiling from a wagon seat. In that absence, conspiracy theories bred like flies. That the Benders were part of a broader network. That someone in law enforcement had protected them. That there were others like them, still operating. Just more discreet. Whether true or not, these ideas were fueled by a single, undeniable fact. No one paid for what was done. No gallows, no confession, no grave with the Bender name. And so the descendants of the dead carried the weight. Names they couldn't pass on, stories they couldn't finish. They lived with holes where memories should have been, and questions that never stopped echoing in their blood. It's here, around the midpoint of the story, that we pause and look inward. Not just at what happened, but at how we respond to it. Because horror, like the Benders, doesn't just stay in history books. It seeps into fears, into families, into the way we view the world when the sun goes down. The Bender killings left more than graves. They left a blueprint for distrust. A lesson that kindness could be camouflage. That the family next door might not be building a life, but burying one, and that every smiling stranger with a seat at the table might be pulling you closer to the trap door. And so I ask you now, where are you watching from? What's the weather like where you are? Sunny, raining, still? Let me know in the comments. Because these stories, these forgotten corners of America's past, are more than tales to be consumed. They're warnings, they're signals, they're the echoes of lives cut short by hands no one suspected. And if this unsettles you, good, because it should. It's easy to believe monsters are rare, that evil needs fangs or fire to be real. But the Benders remind us that horror wears human faces, that the smiling innkeeper, the well-dressed daughter, the silent old man, they're not symbols, they're real. They lived, they killed, and they got away with it. So yes, let's talk about where you are, not just for curiosity, but because evil has always thrived in silence, in isolation, and stories like this, they're how we reclaim the noise, how we remember the victims, not the killers, how we shine a light into places where others would rather look away, because the Bender family may be long gone, but their story isn't. It clings to the land, to the names scratched into unmarked headstones, to the chill that rolls across Labette County every time a traveler loses their way on a back road. So speak, share, remember, because the minute we forget what happened at that little house near the Osage Trail is the minute we invite it to happen again, and next time, it might not be in Kansas, it might be down your road. As the 20th century marched on, true crime morphed into entertainment. Penny dreadfuls gave way to pulps, which gave way to paperback serials, then primetime television, then podcasts. And through it all, one name continued to flicker like a faulty lantern in the shadows: Bender. The farther time removed them from the blood-soaked orchard, the more fascination bloomed around their myth. But behind every sensational retelling, every reenactment, every haunted tour, there was a trail of real dead, real missing, real terror. Labette County refused to monetize it, while other towns leaned into ghost stories or murder tourism. Cherryvale and its surroundings kept quiet. No signs, no tours, no glossy brochures, just a patch of land, privately owned, marked by an unremarkable stone slab and a memory no one wanted disturbed. It wasn't out of reverence, it was out of fear. Locals said the land never healed, that you could feel it under your feet, the pressure like something breathing. Yet researchers kept returning. Documentarians, folklorists, paranormal investigators, most left disappointed. There was no house, no cellar, no remnants of the orchard, just soil, wind, and silence. But a few claimed something lingered. One university researcher from Topeka recorded audio in the field, soft knocks, dragging sounds, a whisper they couldn't isolate. The files were never published. The researcher died in a car accident 2 months later. Her colleagues dismissed the connection. Her mother didn't. She burned the recordings and never spoke of them again. And what of the victims? Those not named, not found, not buried. Some had only vague descriptions. Man with limp, woman in red bonnet, child with crooked tooth. No photographs, no closure, just question marks where lives should have been. Generations later, some families still carry these stories, whispers of a great-grandfather who left and never came back, or a sister who disappeared en route to Denver. They pass them down not as history, but as a warning: never trust the quiet house. In a world driven by evidence, the Bender legacy thrives on absence. No mugshots, no death certificates, no confessions, just a void. And maybe that's what unsettles us most. Not the blood, not the ritual, but the unanswered space where justice should be. A silence too loud to ignore. A gap that no archive can fill. Because you can close the cellar, you can burn the orchard, but some roots run too deep to ever die. As the 21st century arrived, the Benders slipped from textbooks into the back alleys of Reddit threads, midnight YouTube dives, and podcast episodes labeled too disturbing for daylit listening. Their tale had survived not through preservation, but through obsession. People wanted to understand the mechanics of that kind of evil. What made a family kill together? What quiet pact was spoken in that home, where murder became as mundane as supper? But no one has ever truly answered that question. Theories multiplied, each darker than the last. One posited that the Benders were spiritual zealots, believing death cleansed the soul. Another claimed they were government plants gone rogue, an absurd but enduring fantasy. A third, more chilling still, suggested that the family wasn't a family at all, but a loosely connected ring of killers who posed as kin. This, some argued, would explain the lack of birth records, the odd age gaps, the inconsistent accents reported by visitors. Yet the most common theory, and perhaps the most horrifying, was also the simplest. They were just people, not monsters, not demons, just 4 individuals, united by appetite and opportunity, who chose death again and again and again. That choice, repeated without hesitation, without remorse, is what continues to ripple across time. In a rare surviving journal from a local pastor in 1874, there's a passage that feels less like scripture and more like prophecy. He wrote, "They came not like wolves in the night, but as neighbors in the light, their greetings warm, their hands still wet with sin. Beware the smiling face with no shadow." It's a line that modern readers quote often when discussing the Benders, because it crystallizes what makes them unforgettable, not the violence itself, but the mask it wore. No image of their house remains, only hand-drawn sketches, no confirmed photograph of Kate, the sis. Or dozens have claimed to be her, and still, when people hear her name, a chill travels down the spine, because she wasn't a creature of myth. She wasn't born in fire or raised in a crypt. She walked on 2 feet, sold biscuits at the counter, and asked about your journey. And maybe that's why we're still afraid, because she looked like someone we might trust, and she never had to raise her voice to kill. The unease surrounding the Benders doesn't come solely from what they did, it comes from the absence of resolution. No justice, no grave, no final chapter, just a vanishing act so complete it became folklore. The family left behind no letters, no farewell, no trail. It was as if the wind carried them away. That vanishing is where fear festers, because when evil goes unpunished, it becomes legend, and when legend has no ending, it becomes invitation. Some believe the Benders' escape was aided, that a sheriff, a rancher, or a prominent neighbor helped them disappear, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear. There were whispers that one of the Bender men had dirt on a local judge, and that protection was promised in exchange for silence. These are only rumors, of course, but they refuse to die, and in every rumor, the same question returns. How did 4 known killers vanish so completely, so quietly, in a country obsessed with retribution? The reality is this: by the time authorities arrived, the Benders had a 5-day head start. They split up. This much is likely. One pair may have headed north toward Iowa, another south into Indian Territory. Some believe Kate dyed her hair and posed as a widow starting over in the east. Others think she never made it out of Kansas, and that her bones rest somewhere in the woods near Big Hill. But the deeper truth is more chilling. The Benders didn't need magic or government cover to disappear. They simply needed the same tool that made them successful killers: anonymity. In 19th century America, a name change and a few counties' distance was often enough to vanish forever. No photographs, no national database, no forensics. You could reinvent yourself with nothing but a lie and a confident smile. And Kate Bender, she had plenty of both. That's why her image still haunts the minds of many, not because of what she looked like, but because we don't know. We never truly saw her. We saw her role, her performance, but her real face, her real self, slipped away in the dust like so many of her victims. And when something human disappears that completely, it doesn't fade, it metastasizes, it waits. Because the Benders didn't just escape justice, they escaped memory. Every now and then, someone claims to find something new: an old diary, a rusted weapon, a photograph with a woman in the background whose eyes feel too knowing. But none of it ever sticks. No proof, no confirmation. The Benders remain, maddeningly, unsolved. And that lack of finality has given rise to a new kind of obsession, not just with the crimes, but with the possibility that they were never alone. In the decades after their disappearance, a series of eerily similar cases emerged across the Midwest. Families of 4 or 5, living on the edge of towns, often operating small businesses, often hospitable to lone travelers. In Iowa, a blacksmith and his son were accused of robbing and murdering 3 men who stayed the night in their shed. In Arkansas, a mother and her teenage daughters were suspected of drugging male guests and drowning them in a well. None of these cases reached the same notoriety, but in private letters and police memos, a term began to appear again and again: Bender copycat. The idea that the Benders were not an isolated evil but a precedent is one that unsettles historians. If they inspired others, it wasn't through doctrine or writing, it was through story. The legend of the bloody Benders spread through saloons, newspapers, and whispers in wagon trails. The idea that murder could be profitable, repeatable, survivable, was planted. And where seeds like that are sown, others follow. It's a reminder that horror isn't always buried with its perpetrators. Sometimes it lives on in those who admired the audacity. The fact that the Benders got away wasn't just infuriating, it was inspiring to the wrong kind of mind. And as the decades churned forward, with law enforcement always one step behind the shadows, the fear remained that a smile at the front door might still be a snare. In 1952, a man in Nebraska confessed on his deathbed that his and father was John Bender Jr. No proof was offered, no bodies were exhumed, but it was enough to make local headlines, enough to reopen wounds. The story was reprinted, and so, the cycle began again. Because in every generation, someone digs up the Benders, not their bones, but their legend, and in doing so they resurrect the silence that followed each scream. If you walk the old Osage Trail today, you wouldn't know it once ran red. The land is overgrown, the roads rerouted, GPS won't take you to the exact spot, and most who live nearby won't tell you where to find it, not because they don't know, but because they still don't want you there. There are things the locals never wrote down, old warnings passed from mouth to ear like folklore, like infection. Don't walk alone, don't stay long, and don't bring a shovel. The stone marker that now stands near the former Bender property is small, easy to miss. It reads like a footnote, not a monument, a brief mention of a family and a few vanished souls. But under that quiet marker is a noise that never stops, a rumbling ache of unanswered cries. Generations have come and gone, and still the wind doesn't rest in that place. Still the birds change course when flying overhead. Some swear you can feel it in your chest, the pressure of watching eyes. And here's the thing. The Benders didn't just kill, they inverted reality. They made safety dangerous. They made kindness fatal. They didn't hunt in forests or alleys or war zones. They killed where people were supposed to feel safest, around the dinner table. They turned hospitality into a weapon, and the world has never fully recovered from that betrayal. The Bender case left a scar on the national conscience. It taught us not to trust too easily, to ask more questions, but it also seeded something else, a creeping doubt that maybe we can't ever truly know the people we live beside, that maybe the darkness isn't on the fringes of society, but woven through it, quiet, smiling, waiting. One historian wrote in 1987, after a decade researching the case, "The Benders may be gone, but their template lives on. We see it in every killer who charms their way into trust, in every family who hides a secret beneath their flaw, in every town that chooses silence over suspicion." And he was right, because evil doesn't announce itself. It blends, it adapts, and sometimes it knocks on your door wearing an apron, asking if you'd like something warm to eat. In the final months before their disappearance, a strange shift occurred in the Benders' behavior. Survivors who passed through, those lucky or unassuming enough to avoid being killed, recalled that Kate had grown more agitated. Her seances became more urgent, her speeches less coherent. She spoke of visions, of spirits crowding around her bed at night, of a weight pressing on the walls of the house. John Jr. was seen pacing outside the home long after midnight, muttering to himself. Even the ever-silent John Sr. was spotted sharpening tools with a tremble in his hands. It was as if the act of murder, once routine and surgical, had begun to unravel them from the inside. One traveler later testified that during a brief stop at the inn, Kate took his hand and whispered, "This place is hungry, it wants more." He thought she was being cryptic, perhaps spiritual, but in hindsight, the words gnawed at him. Was she referring to the land, the house, or the family itself, consumed by the very violence they had conjured into the walls? There's a long-standing belief in folklore that certain places drink blood, that they remember pain. In some cultures, murder grounds are salted to prevent spirits from rising. In others, trees grown over graves are never touched for fear of inheriting the dead's madness. Kansas has no such rituals. The Bender house was simply torn down, scattered across barns and fences and floorboards. The wood burned in stoves, the stones used for garden walls. But what if destruction wasn't enough? What if the soil itself had kept a record? Locals claimed their animals grew sick when penned too close to the Bender site, that children born near the property had violent dreams. One man tried to build a house on the land in the 1940s. He moved out 6 months later without explanation, leaving everything behind. The house stood empty for years before it, too, mysteriously burned. No cause was ever determined. It leaves us with a disturbing possibility that the Benders didn't just bring evil with them, they awakened it, fed it, and when they vanished, what they left behind wasn't just a story, it was a wound in the earth, a place where nightmares root and wait to bloom again. As whispers of the Benders began to fade into legend, a curious phenomenon emerged, a chilling echo of their presence in modern times. Late one autumn evening, a local farmer repairing a barn on the outskirts of Labette County reported a strange occurrence. While inspecting an old, forgotten cellar in a dilapidated outbuilding, he discovered walls etched with symbols and cryptic markings that he swore were not part of the original structure. They were scrawled in what appeared to be rusted red, resembling blood, an inscription that read, "Return what was taken." The farmer, unsettled by the find, closed the cellar and never returned. Yet over the following months, residents reported similar symbols appearing on barns, fences, and even ancient gravestones in local cemeteries. These were not random acts of vandalism, as many argued. They were deliberate, ritualistic, and eerily reminiscent of the Benders' own methods of marking their territory. In town meetings and whispered conversations, the question began to surface: had the Benders' spirit somehow embedded itself into the land, awakening a dormant legacy of horror? Some older residents claimed that even before the Benders vanished, there were hints that their work was only a fragment of a more sinister plan, a plan that the earth would never forget. Locals spoke of unseasonal chills that would creep over the fields at dusk, of sudden gusts of wind that seemed to echo the sound of a hammer striking a wall, of footsteps that staggered over the earth in unison long after the clock struck midnight. There were rumors that a descendant of the Benders, or perhaps a devoted copycat inspired by their infamous deeds, had taken up residence in a nearby abandoned farmhouse. Though never seen, this presence was felt by those brave enough to tread near the old property, where the trees twisted into unnatural shapes and the sky always eyes seemed a shade darker. Investigators from local law enforcement, along with a few paranormal enthusiasts, combed the region for clues. They questioned families about strange dreams and unusual occurrences. Their findings painted an unsettling picture. Communities still carried the weight of a murderous past, their lives interwoven with shadows too persistent to cast off. Though no concrete evidence emerged linking the signs to the original Benders, the pattern was disturbingly clear. Whatever evil had been unleashed that fateful time had not been entirely contained. It had seeped into the soil, into the air, into the very legacy of Labette County, waiting patiently for the next unwary soul to disturb its restless slumber. By the late 20th century, Labette County had learned to live with its ghosts, but not to forget them. Generations passed down the story like an heirloom, each retelling darker, more vivid, more personal. Some claimed their great-grandparents had nearly been victims. Others said they knew someone who saw Kate Bender after the escape, disguised in a veil, boarding a train with blood still on her boots. These stories blurred the line between fact and myth, but one truth remained constant. Fear has a long memory, and in Labette County, fear wears the face of a family. The local museum, small, dusty, unassuming, kept a locked drawer of Bender memorabilia. Among the brittle newspaper clippings and faded wanted posters was a page from a child's diary, allegedly found near the orchard in the 1930s. The handwriting is shaky, juvenile. It reads, "Mama says never go near the place where the ground breathes. I saw a lady standing there. She had no shadow. She smiled too wide." The page was never authenticated, but the curator refuses to remove it. When asked why, she simply says, "Some things want to be remembered, some things demand it." Modern visitors who find the unmarked trail often report strange feelings: headaches, ringing ears, disorientation. Cameras malfunction, batteries drain. One woman claimed she blacked out for several minutes while standing in the field, waking up with soil under her fingernails and no memory of digging. These incidents are chalked up to heat stroke, anxiety, imagination, but not everyone accepts those explanations. And then there's the trapdoor. The original was destroyed, of course, but rumors persist of its twin, another built to the same dimensions, stored in a barn that changed hands too many times to trace. Some say it still exists, propped against a wall in an old cattle shed. Others insist it was burned, though no ashes were ever found. What makes the Bender story so powerful isn't the number of bodies or the brutality of their deaths. It's the stillness, the unanswered questions that stretch like open mouths across the years. Who were they, really? Why did they stop? Or did they ever? And most terrifying of all, if evil can hide so easily in a family, in a home, in a dinner invitation, then how many Benders have we already welcomed into our lives, without even knowing? There is one final theory, whispered only in certain circles. Historians who drink too much at conferences retired sheriffs who've seen too many things they can't explain, descendants of victims who never stop watching over their shoulders. It's a theory that turns the Benders from murderers into something worse, keepers of a threshold, not merely killers but gatekeepers to something older, something beneath. That the cellar was more than a hiding place, it was a doorway. That the repeated killings weren't just ritual, they were offerings. The pieces, though unsettling, do fit. The precise repetition, the silence afterward, the strange symbols found on the floorboards, the psychic proclamations of Kate, her talk of spirits pressing through the veil, of the earth demanding more. What if she wasn't delusional? What if she wasn't lying? What if the family didn't kill because they were monsters, but because they believed they were feeding something that lived under them? One report, long buried in county records, described an excavation attempt in the 1890s. A group of men tried to dig deeper into the old cellar site, hoping to find more remains. They didn't get far. The ground collapsed beneath them into a sinkhole, a deep, unnatural pit. They lowered a lantern on a rope, and it disappeared into a darkness so absolute it swallowed the light. They filled the hole the next day, said it was unstable, unsafe, but some believe they found what the Benders were feeding, and they buried it again, not to protect the town, but to keep it sleeping. Of course, this all strays from documented fact, but that's the nature of this story, isn't it? The closer you get, the more the details blur, the names fade, the photographs vanish, the earth reclaims its dead, and we're left with impressions, shadows on walls, cold breath in still air, the sound of a creaking chair in an empty house. And maybe that's the legacy of the bloody Benders, not just a trail of corpses, but a door left slightly ajar, a whisper that reminds us how thin the skin of safety really is, that behind every smile could be a hunger, behind every floorboard, a mouth, and beneath every home, something ancient waiting for its next invitation. There is no grave for Kate Bender, no known final photograph, no confession, no bones, no closure. She vanished like smoke from a chimney, and in doing so, she became eternal. Because there's something terrifying about an evil that doesn't end, something worse than death, disappearance. Evil unresolved doesn't decay, it replicates, and in the century and a half since the Benders' blood-soaked trail went cold, that replication has taken root in every lonely highway, every isolated family business, every smiling face behind a counter that feels just a little too rehearsed. This story didn't stay in Kansas, it spread. It embedded itself in the American psyche, in our ghost stories, in our cautionary tales, in the way we glance over our shoulders when stopping at roadside inns. It is the fear of being lulled, of being welcomed, comforted, and then erased. The Benders didn't just kill travelers, they desecrated trust, they weaponized warmth, and no number of years will ever undo that kind of harm. The land where they lived is quiet now, but it is not empty. Roots twist deeper than ever. The wind there still refuses to move right. Ask any old-timer if they'll speak of it at all, and they'll tell you, nothing good grows on that land. Grass dies, birds avoid it, and if you stand there long enough you might hear it, that gentle rhythmic sound, like something tapping beneath the soil, a call, or a memory, or the echo of a chair tipping backward just before the floor opens up. So if you find yourself one day driving through the flatlands of Kansas, and the sun dips just below the horizon, casting shadows like fingers across the prairie, and you spot a house set just off the road, old, small, but warm-looking, keep driving. No matter how tired you are, no matter how kind the voice is that calls out from the porch, because the Benders were not buried, they were not punished, they were not erased. They were absorbed by the land, by the silence, by the story, and some stories do not want to end.